You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. How's it going?
Pretty good.
It's another day in paradise,
Yes,
and
it is.
we're getting closer to summertime.
Yes.
These chilly, snowy nights are hopefully going away quickly.
Hopefully.
So today's topic's an interesting one. Obviously, it's something I deal with all the time, and it's the importance of hiring the proper professional. The reason I wanted to talk about this is I hear this all the time. Did I hire the right inspector? Did I hire the right remediation contractor? Last week, we talked about SPCs. Did I hire the right SPC company? It's an important subject. But how often do you hear me talk about, they hired the wrong company?
A lot. Far too much. Far too much.
A lot of our work, if one of our listeners is a client that we've done remediation for, you probably know this, but most of our work is coming in and cleaning up after somebody else.
Correct. I think because it feels like so many people are in a panic when they see toxic mold or when they figure out through testing they have toxic mold, and they get so in a rush to get it remediated that they hire the first person who comes along or the first recommendation they get, and they don't do their due diligence.
Yeah, that's spot on. And it's easy for me to say because it's not my home, it's not my health. But most of the time, people do make an emotional decision. And I say to them, and I understand it's probably not coming across very well, but I say to them, this issue's probably been going on for months, if not years. You shouldn't be in a major rush.
Correct.
And like I said, that's easy for me to say. If they have a child that's sick or a spouse that's sick, they just want to get out immediately. Well, you can get out of the home if you have somewhere to go stay at, family members or whoever. But on the other hand, I wouldn't make such a big decision so quickly and then hire the wrong company.
What's interesting is doing your due diligence, and I think maybe go into that a little bit, because sometimes people think their due diligence is, I went to their website, they were referred to me by my doctor or by a healthcare professional. I looked up their certifications and they had the standard certifications, and I asked them what they would do and they told me what they would do, and it sounded like what they should be doing. Is that enough due diligence in your mind?
Well, I mean, this is simple answer. If they're the right company, then yeah. But most states, you don't have to be certified. So, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, most of these states, you don't have to be a certified mold remediation contractor. Now, there's different certifications. There's the IICRC. There's NAMRI, there's CIEC, like that's a consultant, but you get what I'm saying. There's tons of different companies out there that offer certifications. I always compare it to, like, it's like deciding what university you're going to go to. If you get an MBA from, Auburn, like you did, versus an MBA, let's say, from University of Wyoming, does it really matter?
Depends on where you live.
Exactly. And I guess my point is, these certification companies, IICRC, I believe, is based out of Florida, which Florida is regulated. So, you have to be a certified mold inspector. You have to be a certified mold remediation contractor. But for the most part, most people don't understand or know that IICRC is maybe based out of Florida. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, there's so many different certifications out there. How do you decide who you're going to use? Yeah. Like, how do you think I decided?
Well, you'd use you. That would be pretty simple.
But no, what I mean is, how do you think I decided, like, which certification I'm going to get?
I think you look it up and see if you like their curriculum and how you get certified. And then you go, okay, this sounds good.
Yeah. And I did this so many years ago. Internet wasn't that big. But for the most part, I think most people, they're going to look at a few different certifications and they're going to be like, okay, what do I have to have for my state? Or what do I want to have? And what's it going to cost? Like you said, the curriculum is very important too. How long is it going to take me? When I got my certifications, I really didn't pay that much attention, honestly.
Well, but I think that's where it gets very, very tricky for people, because people like to think that if somebody has behind their name 10 credentials, right? There's some people who love to have credentials in their email signature.
Yeah.
And so then the more credentials people see, the more they go, oh my goodness, this person must know what they're talking about. When in reality, just because you have a certification or a degree doesn't mean you actually have the skill to do the CSI investigation required to do mold remediation well.
Exactly. And that's something I say all the time. The certification doesn't mean you're qualified. It just means you followed the proper steps. But on the other hand, just because somebody's been doing it for 30 years doesn't mean that they know what they're doing either. And I want to go back to what you were asking earlier about how our listeners decide who they're going to go with. Well, you go to the website, you're seeing, for the most part, the information about the owner. Now, if that owner's not on site the entire time for your project, you're getting people below the owner, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but are those technicians certified? Most of the time they're not.
Yeah, because they're working under the certification of the owner in the owner's company.
Yep. And on top of that, like I said, most municipalities, you don't have to be certified. So for our listeners, I would be very careful. If you were to call me, you would get to talk to me and you would hear my knowledge, which you can hear in the podcast. But if I'm not on site, what good does all of my qualifications do?
No good. But I think that's one of the first considerations, that when somebody sees toxic mold and they're running to get it remediated, they skip this step. The first question in my mind should be, do you want to work with a company where you get the expertise and direct contact with the owner of the mold remediation firm? Or do you want to go with a franchise or a larger company where you won't get the owner on site for your mold remediation project?
Exactly.
Like, your answer to that question will determine who you look at even to consider.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I'm not saying that if the owner's not there, their technicians aren't qualified. But on the other hand, like you said, so are you going to go with one of these franchise companies, which I know in Utah, for some reason, it's kind of the new fad. Mm-hmm. Restoration companies, like everybody and their dog's becoming a restoration company. But do you want that type of company that's a franchise and you're only dealing with the project manager? Now, I get it. Like, if you're the big national franchise companies, you're not going to have the owner show up. I get that part. Nor with CNC are you always going to have me on site. So I want to be clear with our listeners, just keep that in mind when you're talking to the person on the phone, because that person might not be the one performing the work.
Correct. But it is a valid question to say, do you want that to be an option?
Yeah.
So if you want it to be an option that the owner would be involved with your project, that would slim down the number of companies you call even to get a bid.
Exactly. And, is that owner of the company only showing up in the morning? Or does he or she show up once or twice throughout the project. Like those are the things you have to consider. But even on top of all of that, if you want the owner of a big franchise company, that's probably not realistic. But on the other hand, it's going to cost you a lot of money.
Correct. But I think there are also deeper things. I mean, lots of people do look for their certifications, which I think is a first level question. But when you get potential mold remediation companies to come out and do a bid, I wonder how many people actually interview them at the same. Does that make sense? Meaning, like, how do you approach doing mold remediation? Do you encapsulate? Is that your strategy? I don't think a lot of people do enough homework and do enough education, like with your Mold 101 digital bundle or your mycotoxin prevention. I don't think people are educated enough up front to then, when they get bids, ask the important questions that will, how long on average does it take? How do change orders work? You know what I mean? Like, I don't think they know what to ask, which is why they don't ask.
Yeah. And we have an opt-in.
Yes.
It's free. How to hire the proper contractor. Obviously, our listeners know this. If you have signed up on that email list, it's a pretty simple document. It's very basic questions. But if you're not getting what you think you need for your project, I do consulting throughout remediation projects. I can write a scope of work to your specific project. There's services I offer.
Absolutely.
But to go back to what you're saying, for the most part, there's a few crucial things that I would be asking. Are you certified? Are you insured? How long have you been doing this? What does it typically cost per day to have you and your crew on site? How do you do remediation? Are you familiar with mycotoxins? Obviously, our listeners know I'm very knowledgeable on this part of it, but there are a lot of important questions you got to ask. How long is it going to take? Can I stay in my home? There's a bunch of questions, and that's where it makes it very difficult to make a decision. If you find a mold problem in your house tomorrow, I wouldn't tell you, unless, let's say your basement just flooded. I wouldn't be in a rush to get somebody out there on Tuesday.
Yeah.
I mean, waiting a week or so, there are things you can do. If it's a certain room, you can contain that mold infestation. Like, there are things you can do. Just don't rush into getting the first company that can come do the work. Because if you called me and I said, yeah, I can be there tomorrow, that tells everybody I'm really not busy.
Correct. And the issue that happens is when you choose the wrong company to do mold remediation, and then you figure out mid-project, while they do have possession of your home, while they are doing whatever things they're doing, it's really hard to bring in another company behind that to fix up what they messed up.
Yeah, that's a very, very difficult situation for all three parties. We have the listener or the people that are living in the home. You have the current contractor and you have the other contractor you want to bring in. There's lots of conflicts that would be something that you would have to consider. Now, to go back to what you're saying, I think the easy answer to that is if you've already signed a contract with the current company, unless you can get out of that contract, you should probably have them finish their scope of work.
Correct. But here's the question. How often do people fully get the scope of work and a fully fledged out contract in advance of the work? I mean, if you're getting a bid that isn't clear as to what the scope of work to be performed is, should you be going with that company?
No.
Okay.
No, the scope of work, in my opinion, whether you sign the scope of work or the estimate or a contract, the scope of work for me is the most important document for our listener to have.
And can you just define because some people might not understand what should be in a scope of work?
So let's say that there's a mold infestation in the laundry room. The scope of work is going to give approximate square footage. It'll clearly define we are removing the washer, we're removing the dryer, we're doing a flood cut at a height of 4 feet for 15 linear feet. We're going to establish containments. We're going to establish negative air. Once the sheetrock's removed, we're going to abrasively remove the suspected mold on the wood framing materials. Maybe it's a subfloor we're going to tear out. It's very clear. We will perform an SPC inside of the containment. Our estimate includes, removing all the floor protection, removing the containments. It's very clear. The interesting part about it is a lot of times I like to compare compare what we do to the medical field. But when you go in and have a surgery, let's say you're doing the sinus surgery, they're going to go over the main whatever words that the things they're going to do, but do they give you a step-by-step?
No, because they're the specialists, so they're not going to. But also, this brings up a whole other thing, because on the mold remediation side, I do think that people who are not familiar with how it works, they're under the assumption that I hired this company to come remediate the mold in my home. And so then when the scope of work is complete for that laundry room, and that was all that was in that scope of work, and then the company leaves and the homeowner finds mold in the family room, they get upset at the mold remediation company because they're like, wait a second, you were supposed to remove all the mold in my home, and now there's mold in the family room. Why didn't you deal with that? Yeah. But that wasn't in the scope. Can you kind of explain that? Because I think people get confused.
Yeah, that's probably the most common issue I deal with as a mold remediation contractor. So I'm going to go back to the whole laundry room comparison. If we go in there and we say we're going to remove the floor covering, and let's just say it's linoleum. Mm-hmm. Well, let's say we remove that, and my scope of work says that we're going to treat the subfloor, meaning when I use the term treat, it doesn't mean I'm just spraying it. Mm-hmm. We HEPA vacuum, we abrasively remove suspected mold. Anyhow, let's say I remove the linoleum and the floor is rotted out. That's not in my scope of work. Now, am I just going to not do it because I'm being mean? No, it just takes a lot more work to do that. And for our listeners, you have to understand too, we're leaving a big hole in the floor. It's a safety issue. But I go to my client and I say to them, okay, here's what we found. We removed the floor covering. The floor is all rotted out. This has actually been going on for a long time. This is what it should cost. And once again, it's not going to just cost an extra $500.
No, this is a change order.
Exactly. And I probably should have said that, but this is a change order and it's going to cost, $1,500. Well, my client has the option of saying, no, we're not going to pay the $1,500, or yeah, take care of it, Steve. But here's it's a big rabbit hole I don't want to go down. But let's say we remove that subfloor and we go back to what you were saying, like the client thinks that we're getting rid of all the mold. We remove the subfloor and below that's a floor joist. If the floor joist is rotted out or there's substantial water damage to it, does that change order include taking care of the floor joist? No.
Yeah,
now,
it's a change order.
On the other hand, it's a floor joist. Like, it's not that big a deal, but then think about, and this is why I said I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole. If there's a floor joist there's probably a basement below it. What if the ceiling in that bathroom is showing mold that's below it?
That's a change order.
Exactly.
But I think that's what people don't seem to understand. They assume that when they bring a mold remediation company, they're going to come in and they're going to do a full inspection and they're going to find all the mold, which you can't find mold behind walls that you can't cut into. So that's not happening in an inspection. And then they're going to do their mold remediation. And yes, there's a scope of work, but if there's mold outside of that scope of work, they're just going to handle it because they're in there. Well, no, all of those things are change orders, and there may be toxic mold behind walls that are in rooms that did not fall within the scope of work.
Exactly. Yep. And, I want to backtrack a little bit because, some of our listeners that are listening will be like, well, I hired Steve and he spent 2 extra days taking care of whatever. There are a lot of situations for me that with my client, I say, okay, I built in 2 days of extra work and I'll do what I can within those 2 days. If there's anything beyond that, it's going to be a change order. So I want to be clear, like with our listeners, going back to who you choose, it would make sense, because I say it all the time, mold is the gift that keeps on giving. It would make sense when you're choosing the remediation contractor to tell them, okay, what if we have, let's say it's a 2-man crew, that's typically what it is, 2 or 3 people. What would it cost us if we needed you for 2 more days? It would be very, very advantageous to roll that into your project.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
But on the other hand, the negative side of that is that's all you're going to get is 2 more days. If it's going to take 3, that's going to be a change order.
Correct. And so I think the key thing here is when you're hiring the proper professional, you have to understand that the scope of work is the blueprint of the work they're going to do. And anything that is found outside of that by them is a change order. And when they leave, anything you find that is outside of that scope of work is a whole new project that you have to then bring somebody in to handle. I guess my question, though, is what if you've done all your due diligence, they have the certifications, they were highly recommended, and you hire a mold remediation company that doesn't actually properly remove the mold. They sort of cover it up.
Encapsulate.
Are you screwed? I mean, what happened? What do you do? Like, because eventually that whatever's covered up is going to come back out. So what do you do in that situation?
So that's a difficult situation. I actually just dealt with a project similar to what you just said. They encapsulated everything, which is in the IICRC S520 standards, but it's a last resort. When you say it's eventually going to come out, like, that's not always the case. But with this situation, they guaranteed PRV results. Of course you can guarantee your PRV results in your own containment because you encapsulated everything. That's kind of in my opinion, kind of a no-brainer. But on the other hand, my client assumed that they were going to do it properly and abrasively remove it. At the end of the day, to answer your question, are you're just going to have to take the hit, pretty much.
Wow.
And that's where it's really important. Like, for our listeners, it's very important to have that scope of work and to talk to the contractor and say, you're going to abrasively remove everything you can, correct?
Yeah.
Because that's an important statement or question. Because there are times that, let's say it's on an exterior wall. Well, we can't remove that wall stud, so we are going to encapsulate it. But you can clearly see, as our listener, you can see that they sanded down until right where they couldn't, and then they encapsulated it. That's a whole different thing versus a floor joist that's right in front of them or a wall stud that they chose not to sand because they ran out of time.
Correct. Yeah. So really, that's an important question. In your approach to dealing with mold in my house, are you going to abrasively remove whatever you can?
Yep. And it needs to be in the scope of work.
Yeah, it needs to be in the fine print.
Exactly.
And so if you're signing a contract, but you have no scope of work, should you be signing that contract?
No.
Okay.
No. And I say this to my clients all the time. It's to protect you, and it's to protect someone like myself, the remediation company. Because if I told a client, hey, you talked about this earlier, we're just to make sure there's no mold in your house, there's no way I would ever say that.
No, because it's just too much. It's too. At the same time, though, I do think there are situations where a mold remediation company might say, we're going to do a full inspection and we're going to charge you a certain amount to spend a few days doing mold discovery.
Yeah.
Like before we even get to the remediate, like we're going to spend a few days really with your permission to cut walls. I mean,
exactly.
you, in order to do a full mold discovery, you'd have to have permission to cut open walls, right?
Yeah, but that would have to be done inside containment.
Yeah,
too.
So even that, so if somebody really wanted to know what is the full landscape of mold in my home, it actually would require a lot. That's why most people don't do it, because then you might as well just remediate what we see.
Yeah, and the caveat to that is a lot of times we're just trying to lower that burden. By no means am I telling our listeners that's okay to do. Just remediate the big stuff. But on the other hand, that might be enough of the burden removed from the person's body that they could feel better. I would never recommend that. But on the other hand, I understand if I was the homeowner, you're sitting there going, well, Steve, when does this end?
Yeah, like how long am I going to be living in a hotel room?
Exactly.
For how many months while you find all the mold?
Yeah. And that's where, once again, it sounds crazy. And if you're a listener, you're like, yeah, Steve, you're obviously just a remediation contractor. It makes more sense for me to, if I was the listener, to say to my contractor, here's what I'm going to pay you to do, and go over and above. And more or less say, I want you to remove all the walls in the laundry room. I want you to remove all of the floor coverings. And that way, it's going to be higher on the front end, but both entities understand what they're signing up for.
Absolutely, because I think a lot of people get surprised by change orders because they don't realize, and maybe sometimes mold companies aren't completely transparent up front, but change orders are pretty standard, normal. You can expect you're going to have them on any mold job.
Yeah,
kind of
I was going to ask you don't show up on the job sites. How many times have I not had change orders?
Zero.
Yeah. It's virtually impossible.
Yeah. So, and I think people don't understand that up front.
Yeah.
So they figure, okay, you're charging us $30,000.
Yeah.
It's just going to be $30,000, and then they get blindsided.
Yeah.
By this one and this one and that one and this one. And then they feel like they're at the mercy of the mold remediation firm because they have possession of their home.
Right.
Right? Like, so then you're like, well, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, where if they had known up front that, yeah, 30,000 might be the bid, but change orders are a given. They're going to come. Yeah. It's going to be like, then they could have felt differently about when those come.
Yeah, and I know we've gone longer than we normally do, but I think this is an important thing to bring up too for our listeners. When you're hiring the mold company, each company should be giving a bid on the same scope of work.
Yeah.
Because most of the time, and I see it all the time, they go with the cheapest company, and then that company intentionally knows they're going to be the low bidder, but then they slam my clients with a bunch of change orders.
Yep.
That's something to keep in mind too, which it brings up something that's really important. Make sure, I don't care who the IEP is, and for those that don't know what that means, indoor environmental professional, it's an umbrella term. Could be an industrial hygienist, a mold inspector, a mold remediation contractor, whatever. Make sure you hire a third-party company to create your scope of work for you. That's very important.
Then that way everybody you're having bids on the same scope of work.
Yeah, so that's the problem is like when you have these companies that say, we give free estimates, what do I always say about that?
Nothing's free.
Yeah. I mean, they're going to make the money somewhere. None of us can work for free. But it's important that every company that's bidding on your project is bidding on the same work.
Correct. So you have you get a pretty consistent measure of who is charging what, not just somebody pretending they're the low bidder, but really they're not at all.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm not saying that companies are notorious for it, but I see it quite often. The companies that come in with the lowest bid are typically the companies that are notorious for covering things up and or charging a bunch in change orders.
Absolutely. And is it a red flag if somebody comes in and they give you a free bid and they literally take 30 minutes to do the bid?
Major.
I mean, there's some red flags that you should know off the bat.
Yeah.
If they're only spending 30 minutes looking at your home, probably a red flag.
Yeah. And, we're going to be talking about it in I think next week or in a couple of weeks about the importance of mold inspections. For our listeners that have been listening long enough, first and foremost, I do not give free estimates, period. No. But why is that?
Because you do a full mold inspection and tell people how long your inspections take typically.
Yeah, my inspections, now if it's a typical mold inspection, it's all day.
Day.
It's 8 to 10 hours.
Literally all day.
Now, if I had a client that said, hey, Steve, we live here 30 miles from where you live. Could you do a cheaper, less invasive type of mold inspection? I would kind of chuckle. But on the other hand, I'd be like, okay, I'll treat this more like a bid, but I'm still not doing what needs to be done.
Absolutely. And so it's important to understand that somebody who's going to give you a more accurate bid should be spending longer than 30 minutes in your home.
Exactly. Yeah. People like myself, the good part about doing it the way I do it, I'm creating the scope of work. Mm-hmm. So you're getting 2 for 1. Now, going back to the companies that say free inspections, for our listeners, think about that. That'd be like a doctor saying he'll give you a free evaluation.
Yeah, that doesn't happen.
No.
Not even with lawyers.
But it's going to be a quick...
it's going to be a quick 20-minute thing that doesn't mean much of anything because they're still going to charge you to do the actual inspection.
Exactly. And I think once again, it's easy for me to say, for our listeners, just spend the money and get the proper person in there, the proper IEP that can write your scope of work, and just take that, chunk of $700 and just pay it.
Absolutely. And don't make emotional decisions.
Exactly. So, that was a pretty long podcast.
Yeah. So what's your call to action for people?
Make sure you hire the proper professional. And I just mentioned it earlier, we have digital bundles. I also, for clients across the globe, I write scope of works all the time.
Yep.
And it's not just a copy and paste kind of thing. It's unique to their property.
Correct.
They send me literally measurements of their home. It's very, very customized to their situation. So I offer those things too. But we appreciate all you listeners. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.